Imagine coming home to find the very people you've supported, the people you've treated like family, literally trashing your life's work while they laugh behind your back. I stood in the shadows of my own foyer, watching my son-in-law Mark lead a pack of his rowdy friends through my private villa, gesturing to my antique furniture and custom art, as if he were a tour guide in a museum he already owned. He didn't know I was there, and he certainly didn't know that in exactly 48 hours, I was going to strip everything away from him, leaving him with nothing but the clothes on his back and a massive debt he couldn't possibly pay. He thought he was the new king of the castle, but he forgot who built the walls, and now I have to ask all of you watching this, was I too cruel for what I did next, or would you have burned every bridge just like I did? Please let me know if I overstepped, because even now, months later, the look of pure terror on his face when the locks were changed and the police arrived is something I play back in my head every single night before I go to sleep. To understand how we got to that point, I have to go back to the beginning, specifically to when my daughter, Sarah, first brought Mark home 3 years ago. At the time, I wanted to be the supportive father, the man who welcomed his daughter's choice with open arms despite the nagging feeling in my gut that something was off. I've spent 30 years building a real estate empire, and you don't get to my position without learning how to read people. Yet I ignored my instincts for the sake of Sarah's happiness. Mark was charming, sure, but it was that superficial, polished charm that usually hides a complete lack of substance. He was a consultant which, as I quickly figured out, was just a fancy word for being unemployed while waiting for a miracle. Sarah was head over heels, convinced that he just needed a big break, and like a fool, I decided to be that break. I gave him a high-paying position at one of my firms, bought them a beautiful starter home, and even covered their lavish wedding. I thought providing stability would turn him into a man of character, but all it did was feed a monster of entitlement that would eventually try to eat me alive. My daughter is a brilliant architect, a woman who sees the world in structures and foundations, but she couldn't see the cracks in the man she married. I remember sitting at their wedding reception, watching him toast to family and legacy, while sipping a champagne that cost $500 a bottle. And even then, I saw him eyeing the other guests, calculating who had the most influence and how he could pivot from being my son-in-law to being a player in his own right. I wanted to believe I was just being a protective father, but the way he talked about the house I bought them, as if he'd negotiated the deal himself, made my skin crawl. Over the next 2 years, I watched him slowly alienate the hard-working staff at my firm. He didn't understand the business. He only understood the perks. He'd show up at 10, take 3-hour lunches on the company dime, and spend his afternoons networking at the local country club. Every time I tried to pull him aside for a performance review, he'd deflect, mentioning how happy Sarah was or how they were thinking about starting a family soon. It was emotional blackmail, plain and simple, and I fell for it because I didn't want to be the reason my daughter's smile faded. But the silence I maintained only emboldened him. He started taking liberties with the company accounts, small at first, personal dinners labeled as client meetings, a few expensive office supplies that ended up in his garage, but the audacity was growing. The real trouble started 6 months ago, when Sarah had to leave the country for a long-term architectural project in London. It was a massive opportunity for her career, and I encouraged her to take it, telling her I'd keep an eye on things back home. Since their house was undergoing some minor renovations I was paying for, mind you, I told Mark he could stay in the guest wing of my villa while she was away. It's a massive property, over 10,000 square feet, with a high-tech security system, a private chef, and more rooms than I know what to do with. I figured he'd appreciate the luxury and stay out of my hair while I handled my business. For the first few weeks, he was a ghost. He'd leave early, come back late, and we barely spoke. But then I started noticing small things. A bottle of my vintage Scotch would go missing. I'd find cigar ash on the poolside lounge chairs. Then my housekeeper, Maria, came to me in tears, saying that Mark had been speaking to her like she was a servant in a Victorian novel, demanding she wash his gym clothes immediately, and criticizing the way she prepared his lunch. He even had the nerve to tell her that once I retired, things were going to change around here and she'd better start showing him more respect if she wanted to keep her job. I was livid, but I kept my cool, giving him a stern warning that he was a guest, not the owner. He apologized profusely, putting on that good guy mask again, telling me he was just stressed about work and missed Sarah. It was a lie, and I knew it, but I wanted to wait until Sarah was back before making a permanent move. The mask was slipping fast though. I started getting calls from the country club about unpaid guest fees, from people Mark was bringing in under my name. He was acting like my proxy, using my reputation to build a life of leisure for himself while my daughter was working 16-hour days in London. I began documenting everything: the missing liquor, the complaints from the staff, the unauthorized charges. I even noticed that he had started spending time in my private study, a room that was strictly off limits. One evening, I found the lock had been tampered with. He claimed he was just looking for a stapler, but the way he wouldn't meet my eyes told a different story. He was looking for the safe. He was looking for the deeds. He was looking for a way to cut me out of my own life. The breaking point happened last Tuesday. I was supposed to be in New York for a 3-day conference, but the deal closed early, and I caught a red-eye flight back home. Arriving at the villa around 2 a.m., I expected the house to be silent, but as my driver pulled up to the gate, I saw every single light in the house was blazing. There were 6 cars parked in the circular driveway, cars I didn't recognize. I told my driver to let me out at the gate and stay back. I walked up the drive, my heart pounding with a mix of rage and disbelief. As I let myself in through the side entrance, the smell hit me first: stale beer, expensive smoke, and the heavy scent of a party that had gone on far too long. I walked toward the main living area and stopped in the shadows. There was Mark, sitting in my favorite leather armchair, his feet up on the mahogany coffee table, surrounded by 5 of his frat bro friends. They were loud, obnoxious, and incredibly disrespectful. Mark was telling them how I was losing my marbles, and how he was basically running the show now. He told them that when I passed away, which he joked would be sooner rather than later, this whole place would be his personal playground. He was showing them the secret compartment in the bar where I keep my rarest spirits, handing out bottles like they were water. One of his friends laughed and threw a glass of red wine toward the fireplace, missing and splashing it across a hand-woven rug that cost more than Mark's annual salary. They were talking about me as if I were already a ghost, a nuisance that was just taking up space in Mark's villa. I stood there, invisible in the dark hallway, listening to them plan how they were going to turn my home into a bachelor's paradise for the upcoming weekend while I was safely tucked away in New York. They talked about bringing girls over, throwing a massive pool party, and even borrowing my classic car collection for a joyride. Mark was bragging about how he had the codes to the safe, and how he'd already taken a few thousand in cash to cover his gambling debts. He even went so far as to mock the way I walked and talked, calling me an old relic who didn't understand how the modern world worked. My blood was boiling, but I realized that if I walked out then, he'd just lie his way out of it or call Sarah and make me look like the crazy one. I needed a lesson that would stick. I needed to show him exactly what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness. I thought about the 30 years of sweat and late nights I put into this empire, and here was this boy, who had never built so much as a birdhouse, trying to claim the throne. I quietly retreated, walked back out the side door, and checked into a hotel down the street. I didn't sleep a wink. Instead, I spent the entire night on the phone with my legal team, my head of security, and my bank. I had the security logs pulled, showing every time he'd entered the study, and every time he'd brought unauthorized guests onto the property. I called my contact at the bank to flag the missing cash from the safe, and I reached out to my head of IT to freeze his access to the firm's accounts. So that's the situation I found myself in. I was standing on the edge of a choice that would likely change my relationship with my daughter forever, but I couldn't let this disrespect stand. I had to decide if I should just kick him out, or if I should make sure he never forgot the name of the man he tried to rob. Before I tell you the absolute chaos that unfolded when the sun came up, I want you to pause right now and comment below. What would you have done? Would you have confronted him right then and there? Or would you have waited to plan something bigger? I really want to see your perspective because what I did next was scorched earth. The next morning, the lesson began. While Mark and his friends were likely passed out in a drunken stupor in my guest rooms, my security team arrived at the villa. I had revoked Mark's access to everything: his corporate credit cards, his keyless entry codes, and even his access to the company servers. I had the locksmiths arrive at 8 a.m. to change every single exterior lock on the property. At 10 a.m., I walked through the front door with 4 off-duty police officers I'd hired for a private detail and a professional cleaning crew. The house looked like a disaster zone. There were half-eaten pizzas on the grand piano and cigarette butts floating in my expensive vases. Mark stumbled out of the guest wing in his boxers, rubbing his eyes, looking confused as he saw me standing in the foyer with a line of people behind me. I didn't say a word. I just pointed to the officers. They informed Mark and his guests that they were trespassing on private property and had 5 minutes to gather their personal belongings before being escorted off the premises. The look of pure, unadulterated shock on Mark's face was better than any prize I've ever won. He started stammering, trying to say it was all a misunderstanding, that they were just hanging out. But I silenced him with a single look. I told him, "Mark, you didn't just break my trust. You tried to claim my life. You told your friends I was losing my mind? Well, let's see how sharp yours is when you're looking for a new place to live with $0 in your bank account." He tried to argue, claiming he had a right to be there as my son-in-law, but the police officers didn't care about his family status. They only cared about the deed in my hand. His friends scrambled, grabbing their shoes and bolting out the door, terrified of the police presence. One of them actually tripped over his own feet in his hurry to get to his car. Mark tried to call Sarah, but I'd already spoken to her. I'd sent her the security footage from the night before. The footage of him bragging about my death, stealing from my safe, and mocking her career. She was devastated, but she wasn't blind. She told me to do whatever I had to do, and that she'd be hiring a lawyer the moment she landed. As the officers led him down the driveway, he realized that I hadn't just kicked him out of the house. I'd fired him from the firm for cause, meaning no severance and a very difficult time finding a new job in this industry. I also informed him that the loan I gave him for his house was being called in immediately due to a breach in the contract he'd signed without reading the fine print. Specifically, the clause that stated the loan was contingent upon his continued employment and good moral standing within the family business. Since he'd been stealing cash, that was an easy bridge to cross. By the time he reached the gate, he was no longer the smug king of the villa. He was a broken man with no job, no home, and a very angry wife waiting for him on the other side of the Atlantic. The aftermath was intense. Sarah moved back a month later, and after a very long and painful conversation, she filed for divorce. She realized that Mark had been using her as a ticket to a lifestyle he hadn't earned. He tried to send her dozens of emails, crying about how I was a tyrant and how he was tricked, but the evidence was undeniable. It took a while to repair the house. The wine stains were deep, and the disrespect felt even deeper, but the peace that returned to my villa was worth every cent. I even hired a new security firm to ensure that nothing like that ever happens again. I learned that you can provide for people, but you can't provide them with a soul or a sense of gratitude. Mark tried to sue me for wrongful termination and intentional infliction of emotional distress, but when my lawyers presented the video evidence of him admitting to theft on camera and the detailed logs of his unauthorized spending, his own legal team dropped him within a week. He ended up having to sell his watch and his car just to pay for the initial legal fees. Last I heard, he's living in a cramped apartment with 2 roommates, working a retail job and still trying to figure out where it all went wrong, probably blaming everyone but himself. I think the moral of this story is pretty clear. Never mistake someone's silence for ignorance, and never, ever bite the hand that feeds you, especially if that hand belongs to someone who knows how to build empires. I did what I had to do to protect my home and my family's future, even if it meant being the villain in Mark's story for a little while. I sat in my garden yesterday, looking at the pool where they were planning their party, and I felt nothing but relief. The walls are still standing, the empire is still strong, and the parasite is finally gone. If you think I did the right thing by teaching him a lesson he'll never forget, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel out, and lets me know you appreciate these stories of real-world justice. If you've ever had a family member or a friend try to take advantage of your success or treat your property like their own, share your story in the comments. I'll be reading through them and responding to as many as I can because I know I'm not the only one who has dealt with people like Mark. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of justice and revenge just like this one. Thanks for listening to my story, and I'll see you all in the next one.